All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the third edition of the Champaca Book Club. Since this is an open event, we are expecting many more visitors to come by. So I'll make a short introductory remark about what Champaca is, who I am, and what we do usually. Champaca Book Club was formed about 2 months ago. We have done so far 2 sessions. We meet once a month to discuss books in translations. So this is our plan for this entire year, from July to July. For those of you who don't know Champaca, I'll just read out a short introduction which the founders of the bookstore has sent me. Champaca is an independent women-run bookstore, children's library and cafe. We bring diverse stories and perspectives to our readers and in our children's library through our books and events. We run a small cafe for our community to spend a quiet few hours with a book and a hearty meal. We have an online store that ships across India where you can get yourself a copy of the book we are discussing today, which is Preeto and Other Stories. So before we get to the book, let me just say that I am Somak Ghoshal. I am a journalist and I'm a book critic as well, associated with Mint Lounge, the weekend paper of Mint newspaper. Today we have the great pleasure and honor of having Dr. Rakhshanda Jalil with us, who is a multi-award winning translator, writer, and literary historian. She's also the editor of this book that we are going to discuss today, and also has translated a number of stories which are included in the book. Rakhshanda has published over 25 books and written over 50 academic papers and essays. She runs an organization called Hindustani Awaaz, devoted to the popularization of Hindi-Urdu literature and culture. Before we get to the book proper, let me just tell you a little bit, very, very brief remarks about what the book is about. So Preeto is a collection of stories about how male writers in Urdu view and consequently present, represent, or misrepresent women in their worlds. This is sort of my reading of the collection, and we'll discuss this further. There is a very detailed and superb introduction to the book, which Rakhshanda has written, where she traces the history of writings on women by both men and women. There are discussions of writers like Manto, Ismat Chugtai, and so on. But what we have in the book are these sort of great writers of Urdu fiction, like Rajinder Singh Bedi and Krishan Chandar, as well as some less known writers who write in a slightly non-realistic mode and in experimental styles. So it's a very, very interesting mishmash of styles, voices, approaches brought together within 2 covers. I know we discussed, when we discussed the planning of this conversation yesterday, Rakhshanda mentioned that there is a prehistory to this collection. And I would like to ask you about how this collection was conceived.
Thank you, Somak. First, let me thank Champaca Bookstore and Nirika and Radhika and the whole team, and Somak, you for agreeing to come and read this book not once but twice. You told me yesterday. That makes me very happy. To answer your question, yes, there is a backstory to this present collection. Some years ago, I think 2007 or so, I had edited a collection of short stories by women writers, and specifically women writers from Pakistan. Not all writing in Urdu, some writing in English, but a great many writing in Urdu. I was curious to see how women look at women, write about women in a society that is, let us say, more patriarchal or more closed than others. It has been of interest to me for a very long time to see how women are depicted in literature and in Urdu literature in particular. So I did that collection of women looking at women. But I've all along been curious as to how men have looked at women, specifically in Urdu. We know that in poetry, for instance, the ghazal, for example, there's a tradition going back to many hundred years where the woman has been the subject of a great deal of romantic poetry. Now, with literacy being low in women, among Urdu readers in particular, and being, let's say, just about 100 years old as a literary phenomena, so there weren't that many women writers. And yet literature was being written about women. It was not necessarily for women. It took a while for it to reach the stage where they assumed that there was a female readership. And that is as late as the turn of the century. But till that point, it is not as though the woman didn't figure in Urdu literature. Of course she did. She was the damsel in distress. She was the object of male desire. It was largely a heterosexual view of a woman. And that was cause for great concern, Even when you came across a female voice in Urdu literature, both prose and poetry, what struck you was that it was an occasionally fake female voice. Why? Because there was a vocal masquerade at play. Here was a man assuming that this is how a woman would speak when she's angry, when she's unhappy, when she's sad, when whatever. So in a given setup, it was a bit like a stage play. There was a staged quality to that voice. It didn't. Now, I'm not for a minute implying that women have not written convincingly about men. I was just thinking before this conversation that look at To Kill a Mockingbird. Look at the way Harper Lee, for example, depicts this character of the lawyer. And it's a very bona fide voice. There are no false notes. I'm not saying all men, when they write about women in a fake female voice, it sounds untrue to my ears as a woman or as a reader. I'm not saying that, but every now and then it does. Yeah. And in the absence of there being no women writers, it was left to the men to assume a variety of voices. They were sympathetic, they were empathetic, they were censorious, they were judgmental, they were magisterial. There was a variety of voices. But every now and then there were these false notes, and I was listening to those. And that is the position I'm coming from when I come to this point where I'm looking at 21st century writers. I've only taken two of the older ones, the ones you mentioned, Rajinder Singh Bedi and Krishan Chandar. And then I come to the modern ones like Gulzar and a whole host of others.
Right. It's so interesting that you bring up this idea of, men writing as women or women writing as men, because, this great debate which Virginia Woolf actually addressed in the idea of androgyny in her fiction, in Orlando, for instance, where, a woman and a man sort of gender bending story happens. It is such a difficult thing to pull off. And as readers, we are constantly paying attention from the vantage point of our own genders and experiences to how false or true something sounds.
Yeah.
So when you sort of got to the men, as it were, how did you sort of decide to pick these names out of the sea of stories, I assume, that exist in this universe?
I wanted the two big names. In Urdu, traditionally, there are what are called the four pillars of the short story. Remember that the short story is a very new phenomena. It kind of flowers very dramatically at the time of the partition. Of course, there is Manto, there is Premchand, who's been writing from 1910 onwards and is a very big name in Urdu. And then he moves to writing in Devanagari, and we see him as a Hindi writer. But there is a tradition that Premchand belongs to. So I'm not for a minute saying that it only comes into being from 47, but 47 and the years near about is when the short story flowers very dramatically.
Right.
Many people are experimenting with it, both men and women. In the years leading up to it, we have this remarkable figure of a woman doctor, Rashid Jahan.
Yes.
She is a doctor, she's a communist, as in a member of the party, she's a founding member of the IPTA, she's a founding member of the Progressive Writers Association, she's writing plays for the radio, she's doing a whole host of things. So you see the social reformer, the activist, and the writer. I mean, activist writer is not a new phenomenon. It's not a present day phenomenon. Actually, in all languages, if we were to apply our minds, we can think of people who very successfully brought in, even Premchand for that matter, there's a very strong social concern. But that social concern is sharpened, it's honed by women like Rashid Jahan, who is a precursor to a writer like Ismat Chugtai. So there have been these concerns, but it is the years leading up to the partition where a whole host of isms, as it were, come together. Nationalism, anti-fascism, anti-colonialism, anti-what have you, including feminism, which is not just a burden to be carried by women. And here one needs to say this in different ways, in different degrees. We see a whole host of male writers holding up the pennant for feminism and saying, no, we've got to talk about women. And they do so in different ways. Today, with the benefit of 70 years, and the idea of feminism also changes, if I may digress for just a minute, there
Yeah.
is this, there is a forward that Krishan Chandar is writing for a collection of stories by Ismat Chugtai. And he's writing it from a position of what he sees as great sympathy, right? And he's writing it as a kind of a feminist himself. But what he's saying is problematic for me when I read it 70 years later. Krishan Chandar is saying in this forward, Ismat's stories are as complicated as a woman's heart. Now, this is supposed to be a compliment, but I'm not able to see it as a compliment 70 years later. Why? Because our own understanding of feminism changes. Ismat is held up as a poster girl for feminism, and she writes a story called Gharwali, which is about agency, about sexual agency, and so on. And 70 years later, it's a deeply problematic story because there is an element of censor, there is an element of, somebody deciding agency for another person.
Right.
So all of our definitions of, our ideology is not cast in stone. It changes with time.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I think that's what also gives these stories such a layer of complexity, because you're made to feel so uncomfortable in some of the stories.
Yes.
There is a story called Shonali about
Yes.
this.
It is a very, very, it left me very uncomfortable. So
Yeah.
you were asking me about the selection. I didn't want to be in a comfort zone. I didn't want to have these stories which have no ambiguity, which are very in your face and are making a statement that leaves no room for any kind of misunderstanding. I
Right.
wanted stories which leave you troubled, as you say, make you uncomfortable. Sonali made me very uncomfortable. But that's the male gaze, you
Yeah.
know.
Yeah.
I'm the mother of two daughters, one of whom is listening at the far end of the room. And the male gaze does make you uncomfortable. You see? And that is what this story is, this collection is trying to tell you, that don't allow it to make you uncomfortable. Instead, turn the gaze back.
Right. Right. I think it's also about the women sort of gazing at the men. It comes across so kind of seamlessly into the stories when the writers write these pieces. For instance, in Shonali, which is a story about a maid who looks after this elderly man who's 66 years old. And she does or doesn't know, we don't know this for sure,
Yeah.
whether this man feels a certain sense of attraction towards her. There is a sort of idea that Shonali thinks that this is a very fatherly figure she has to look after. He's aged, he's infirm, but we really don't know what is going on, the dynamic between the two of them.
Yeah. Also, many things are at play. City-bred men seem to think that there is an innocence to a woman from a rural area. So this binary of city and village is very strong, and I think somewhere that too affects gender.
Right, right. I think, because you mentioned Ismat Chugtai, I was thinking of how radical she was for her time, like the themes that she explored, the way that she wrote about human relations. Would you say that the men writing about these women in this collection of stories, do they sort of radicalize the figure of the woman in a certain way?
Do they what?
Do they radicalize the figure of the woman? Do they give the woman enough agency to kind of be in control of her own destiny, as it were, of her desires, sexuality?
Take the story by Gulzar called Mard in Urdu, and in my translations, man. The woman has it talks about how women can go as far out of a marriage as a man can, because here's a marriage in which both have strayed, as it were. The man does, we don't know what price, if any, he's paying, but we are told of the price that the woman is paying. Why? Because we are told that she, at the end of the day, is still yoked to motherhood, and there is a price to be paid for that. Her 13-year-old son ceases to see her as just this mummy person, and she becomes a woman when he accuses her and uses a bad word, accuses her of being pregnant outside of marriage.
Right.
Yeah. So in that instant, when he uses that term and looks at her with hatred, he has grown up. He's no longer her 13-year-old little boy, and he is a mard now. And that is how the story ends. Ki wo ek mard hai.
Right.
So I think somewhere I'm not sure that the writer here is giving agency to the woman, but he's at least acknowledging this duality. That for me is also very interesting. I mean, agency is very good when you see that agency, it pleases you as a reader. But it also pleases you when you see that even that questioning, or that somebody opening a little crack in the door,
Exactly.
as it were.
I think in a lot of these stories, there is a moment of recognition. When I felt that a certain gendering was happening, a man was becoming aware of his maleness, a
Yeah.
woman was becoming aware of her femaleness. This whole sexualized kind of view is not just about the other, but it's also about the self. Like, you also realize your own identity in a certain form, like this boy does, that he's after all a man,
Yeah.
conditioned in a certain way.
By society.
Exactly. So before I go into the other stories, I just had another question about, your sourcing of the material, which is to say, as you said, the Urdu short story is not a very old form. It exists probably 100 years or something now.
Less, yeah. Well,
So,
from Premchand onwards, yeah. So 100 definitely, yeah.
right. So I was wondering, where did you pick up these stories from? Are they do they survive in a magazine culture? Are they in newspapers? Where are the forms in which these stories appear?
I I have a magpie brain. I read very sort of from here and there in an eclectic fashion. One does have access to several non-lending libraries, which in Delhi, the Ghalib Institute has a fabulous collection. The Jamia's library, which has a lot of rare books and rare journals, out-of-print journals. So there are all of these. Those who are, I mean, this is one of Delhi's best kept secrets. There is something called Delnet. I'm sure Bangalore has it too. There's an interlibrary loan network.
Right.
Libraries that are not lending library. For example, the Shastri Bhavan library, which is meant for government officers, but is not a lending library, but it is yet part of an interlibrary loan network. You put in an application for a book which you know is in, let's say, JNU or Shastri Bhavan or here or there, and then the library arranges for the book to come to you, and for a certain number of days. So I think there are these resources that we need to utilize optimally. All of us can't travel, and now with the pandemic and other things, traveling, going to archives, going through libraries is going to become that much more difficult. So I think this is the time when we really need to access all of these resources, which are actually there. It's just that they're not talked about, they're not sufficiently accessed, they're not sufficiently in the public domain. For whatever reason, libraries and institutions are not sufficiently advertising them.
Right.
So this is where I usually find my, archival material.
And would you say that when they first appeared, these stories, were they in magazines and newspapers which ordinary people would be reading?
We seem to forget, but Christian Chandar and Bedi were like rock stars in their time and age. Christian Chandar in particular, I mean, he was so widely read. You see, these people were, and their books were inexpensively priced. They were available at, let's say, the Wheeler Company, if you recall those railway station stalls that, people bought. So reading was very widespread, far more than it is. And it reached the nooks and crannies, of the country. I can think of Wheeler, but I can think of many other bookstores, big and small, all not just in the metropolises, but in the smaller cities, which always had a faithful clientele, as it were. So many of these writers, the older ones, Bedi and Christian Chandra in particular, they were like rock stars in their time and day. They were extremely widely read, and it must be said that at a time when writing was not considered a day job, people usually worked in the film industry like Bedi did, or they had some other source of income, and they also wrote. Christian Chandra earned a living through his pen, as did Manto, for example.
Yes.
So, there's hope for some of us that it is possible to forego. I mean, these are in that sense people who, and it was possible to earn a living by just writing, and they were very eclectic. Manto was forever. I mean, Manto used to say that he's like a hen laying an egg every day. He used that expression for himself. And he actually used to sit on a chair in that crouched position, exactly like a hen about to lay an egg. and he would balance his notepad or his diary or whatever on his knees, bent knees, and he'd be writing there. So it's not like he had a fancy study or a library where he could retreat and write, you know. So he had his kids playing around and he would be writing. So people like Manto, people like Krishan Chandar are interesting for us today because they didn't have day jobs. They only wrote, and this is who they were. I mean, a bit like I write, therefore I am.
Right.
You know, and they earned a living from that.
It's like producing writing for Netflix now, you know, like you're actually giving ready-made entertainment to people in a very different form. But also, you know, when I was reading this collection, I was thinking of how surprisingly mature this literary culture was. Because some of these stories now feels mildly scandalous, you know, to read that they actually sort of exerted their imagination this far. There are sort of hints of incest, and there are sort of all sorts of other uncomfortable taboo, you know, in these narratives. So,
Somak, I must point out, not all the stories are very old. Some are written by contemporary writers also of our time and age.
Right. So I was wondering if you could tell me a little bit about this literary culture, the one that reads Urdu still, you know, like what kind of readership are we looking at? When, I mean, this is pan-India, of course.
It is pan-India. There is very active, but it's pockets. Bihar has a very active reading and writing culture. Some incredible writing is coming out of Bihar. I've used Abdul Samad, Hussainul Haq, and others who are from Bihar. There is Ehsan Beg, who's from Hyderabad. There's Deepak Butki, who's a Kashmiri Pandit, who's written on the Kashmiri diaspora and other things. But the story here is the one that you're referring to about incest and the problems that arise therefrom. So this is pretty much a pan-Indian thing. I like to look at stories in other collections and in other kinds of writings that I do because, you know, there are pockets all over. Aurangabad has a very vibrant Urdu culture. Gujarat, parts of Gujarat, despite everything, still has a vibrant Urdu speaking, Urdu reading, Urdu writing culture, as does Rajasthan. One of the finest contemporary Urdu poets is from Rajasthan. So I think it's spread across India. It's no longer in the UP Bihar belt as we would like to believe, but you know, there is both readership and writers from all of these places.
Right. I think there is this sort of misconception that Urdu is being gradually erased or something, because it seems like a very vibrant culture for non-Urdu readers like us.
Well, actually, it's not so much a misconception. The script and the writing of Urdu, just very recently, I believe the Bihar government has issued some sort of notification where they have stopped making it compulsory as it was till now, till a certain age. And so every now and then there are attacks on sort of the teaching of it, or there are attempts to break it from employment possibilities. And that does strike at the roots of Urdu. Having said that, Urdu is vibrant insofar it is still a language of programming. People like to listen to Urdu programs. They're still reading it in translation. But no language can eventually survive only through programming. There has to be fresh material to be written, to be read. So you can't cut away at the roots and just say that, you know, let's have everything in Roman or let's have everything in Devanagari. That's also not the way forward. Or translation. I mean, I can only provide a bridge, but there has to be something on this side of the river for me to take a bridge to the other side. If there is nothing on this side left, what bridge will I make?
Right. So we'll come to translations, but before that, I'm just going to quickly tell people to type in questions in the comment box below so that we can also address your questions and comments as we speak. Please feel free to type in the comment box. Right. So coming to the point of translation, you know, this is an anthology where you have multiple translators working at various levels and expertise and all of that. Can you give us a sense of what are the problems of translating texts like this into English? Because I'll preface that question with a comment, because, you know, the popular perception is that Urdu is a very florid, rich language. And in one of the stories, actually, there is this Awaiting for the Zephyr, that beautiful story, which I want to talk about at great length later. there is this sort of, the floridness of Urdu, the difficulty of the language, the complexity of the language comes through even in the translation.
Yeah.
Because the protagonist who is being spoken to cannot quite follow the language because he only understands Hindi and a very basic Urdu. So as translators, like how did you sort of cope with this challenge?
Right. I'm so glad you took the example of Awaiting the Zephyr by Sayyid Muhammad Ashraf. Indeed, that particular story and its setting is very stylized, and even in the Urdu original, there's a certain stylized diction and a tone and tenor that is very, very not everyday, not conversational, not idiomatic. It's meant. I mean, it's catered to that setting. And interestingly enough, the translator is an American scholar, Daisy Rockwell, very seasoned translator who's been translating from Urdu and Hindi into English. Now, it was so interesting that she translated that stylized, occasionally archaic Urdu into an English that is nowhere fulsome and florid. I thought it carried that sort of stylized style into English.
Right.
We have other instances where there are certain stories which are very rural. So there is a dialect, especially the Bihar ones, for example. There is a rusticness to the Urdu. Why? Because the person speaking that language is also located in a kind of a hinterland, you see. So you don't expect that person to, let's say, speak Awadhi Urdu, which is from the Lucknow area, or Dakkani Urdu, which is from the Hyderabad area. So naturally, the person speaking that is from a remote forested hamlet in Bihar, and naturally that Urdu will be different. So there are different tones and registers, in the original. And I think the task of the translator, in this case, multiple translators, is to somehow carry that through and not let it be lost. And we as translators are not in the business of writing Queen's English, or so I'd like to believe. And this is a challenge with the publishing house editors. They occasionally want to flatten your curves and your dips and hollows of your language. And I am on a crusade, not just now, but for the past 20 odd years, where I'm trying to say that please allow us to retain our idiosyncrasies, as long as it's not grammatically plain, awkward, or wrong, as long as it is not just bad, clumsy and clunky to the ear. If it's not all of those things, but it's just idiosyncratic, please let the idiosyncrasy remain, because I'm not here as a translator or as an editor to give you Queen's English. You're welcome to go read it elsewhere. Remember, this is a work of translation, and something of the flavor of the original must come through, not at the expense of fidelity and felicity. It's a tightrope walk. How do you maintain the felicity, and how do you decide that, okay, this is not clumsy, but this is, you go by the ear then.
Right. I think sometimes as a reader also, you want to feel the weight of the language,
Yeah.
The
weight and the lightness both.
Yes, yes. I mean, by weight, I mean the exact kind of, the temper of the language, as it were, how sort of elevated it is, how lofty it is. So when you read, for instance, Rabindranath Tagore, who wrote in a very lofty Bengali, these days, the tendency is to flatten him and render him in very, very contemporary English, which is fine, which reaches out to a lot of readers. But also at a very scholarly level, I think it does disservice to the language that existed in that form in the 19th century.
Absolutely. I think that dumbing down is, and this assumption sometimes on the part of publishing editors and others, that we need to make this accessible, and for this to be accessible, it has to be morsel or bite-sized. I don't think so. I think the complexity of the original itself can be challenging sometimes. You take the example of Tagore, so poetry or works of fiction of a certain caliber, I think they should be allowed to retain all of their nuance, their complexity, their sophistication. And I don't think we as translators or editors need to flatten it.
Yeah, yeah. Also, South Asian languages have much more layers to them, I think, than English, because English is a very staccato, flat language in that sense. For the word night, there are like 10 synonyms in Bengali, which is sort of very difficult to render. You have just one word, night, and nothing else. So I'm sure Urdu also has these very many.
Absolutely, you're right. And relationships, it's not uncle and aunt. So
Yeah.
increasingly, when I translate myself, I want to retain, there is a term for a father's elder brother and a father's younger brother and a father's elder brother's wife, and so on and so forth. I don't wish to make it uncle and aunt, because I think, and this is generational. The generation before me took the middle path, and the pioneering generation in the 80s, when translations, I mean, the floodgates really opened up, with Bhisham Sani's Tamas being translated by, let's say, Jayaratan. So that generation wanted to make it accessible. So they would say uncle or aunt, or they
Right.
would say cot for a bed. Why cot? Why not bed? Or why not something else? Or they would say clarified butter. I want to say ghee.
Yeah.
I want to say roti. I don't want to say flat unleavened bread. I think it just is so clunky.
And
So stuff like that. I think we are as, and this is a conversation I love to have with fellow translators. Arunava Sinha, fellow traveler who translates from Bangla, for instance. So he and I and others who translate from other languages often have these conversations, that at the risk of sounding immodest, how we are, as it were, finding our feet, how
yeah,
we are no longer playing to a Western galley, or we no
absolutely.
longer saying that, okay, this is meant for a Western audience. We
Absolutely.
want to say ghee because, well, most people will understand, and those who won't will figure it out.
And
You
also
know,
the Western audience should make an effort,
they should,
because
absolutely,
we, as readers in India, have read so many literatures from across the world without knowing a lot of things, and
absolutely.
taken the trouble to find out meanings of, Latin
We
American
all
references.
did. Yes, yes, absolutely.
So I'm glad that these choices are being made and actively exercised now.
Actively, consciously, there is a kind of a sisterhood, brotherhood, call it, well, fellowship, I suppose,
Right.
of fellow translators who occasionally exchange notes. We bump into each other at translation seminars and conferences and what have you, or we used to in a pre-pandemic world. But
Right.
it's nice to see, and I love to read what others are writing. I especially watch out for what Arunava Sinha is translating from Bangla. So it's interesting to see what other steps other people are taking. And of course,
Hmm.
I don't read Bangla, but I get a sense of, okay, how much is he extending himself into
Right.
English? How many,
Right.
and you get a sense of that
Absolutely.
occasionally.
Absolutely. So, this is just curiosity. I wondered what made you pick Preeto as the title of the anthology. Like, why did you pick
Okay.
that story?
Now, the credit must entirely go to Javed Akhtar.
Okay.
He is a great Krishan Chandra fan, an
Right.
acolyte, I would say. I am not, I must say. I find Krishan Chandra occasionally sentimental, sometimes pedantic, occasionally woolly, meandering, all of those things. And I think Javed Sahab has made it his mission in life to convert as many people to the Christian Chandra school of fiction writing. And once, I remember the time and place where he sat me down, and a bit like a screenplay storytelling, like a director narrates a whole thing to an actor or whatever. He
Right.
narrated this story, with all the vim and vigor at his disposal. And the story came alive for me, you know. We was waiting for somebody. He got someone to pull out two chairs. We sat on someone's driveway, and he narrated this entire story, and it came alive, for me. And in that telling, here was a man telling me the story written by a man. I still had misgivings. How is it a feminist story? And I was full of questions about it. He
Hmm.
says, you hold on to your questions, use them in your introduction, use your questions and your queries and your doubts and your misgivings, but at least put it on the table that this too is there. So that was the reason for the inclusion of Preeto. But to call it, I'm sure you know this just as well. When you're putting a collection together, there's so many things that you go over in your head. What should be the title story? Can it be Man and Other Stories? Can it be The Serpent's Tale and Other Stories? So you come up with permutations, combinations. I
Yeah.
think I chose Preeto because it doesn't say anything. It's just a name. Yeah.
Right.
And it
Right.
there's an ambiguity. Somebody will figure out what this is about. I didn't want to give an outright clue like man or woman and other stories. I
Right.
think there was that. And the story, I'm still no fan of Krishan Chandra despite all of this. Uh, I find him problematic in many ways. But
Right.
I wanted the story to be included because it talks of ambiguity. When men look at women, they see a sphinx-like ambiguous creature. I think that also needed to be brought in. And Preeto does that fabulously.
Yeah, and I mean, for those who don't know, this story is basically about a moment of recognition, which happens many years later after an incident. I don't want to give out the plot, but there is a really sort of chilling moment of recognition in this story. And to me, this is also about looking at the man, looking at the woman. You know, if you know what I mean.
Yeah,
It's
there are two parallels. There are parallel tracks in the story. So as you're saying, in one track, there is the man looking at a woman and she's inscrutable. But that inscrutableness is also in the parallel track, which has a very gory ending. Let's not give away the ending.
yeah,
But I think what interested me and which made me pick the story was this idea that for a lot of men, a woman's heart is unfathomable, you know.
yeah.
So when the male gaze tries to penetrate, but does not always succeed.
And this man actually is okay to live with this unfathomable feeling for years.
Yeah.
You know, like
Oh,
he
yeah.
doesn't
Yeah.
actually engage actively with this mystery, you know, because
Yeah.
he sees something quite disturbing and he doesn't quite know what to do with it. But because the woman doesn't offer him an entry into her world in that
Yeah.
form, he just keeps quiet for years
Yeah.
until
Yeah.
he sort of breaks his silence.
Yeah, and it has very tragic consequences.
Yeah, yeah. So, you know, this is a very, very modernist story, you know, in a very radical sense. And there are other stories like The Well of Serpents, which you just mentioned,
Yeah,
which is a very mysterious, almost surrealist story. And I'm
very. Yeah,
thinking of stories by Nayar Masood, the other writer I've read in
absolutely.
translation,
Yeah,
who is
yeah.
extremely difficult at times to even understand because his prose is like poetry and loaded with sort of various levels of meaning. What kind of ideas and books that circulating around this circle of writers, you know, like were they actually reading Western writers and getting influenced, or were their inspirations coming from within their circles? What was going on?
You know, I think some people might think that Urdu writers are parochial or they're writing in some sort of well. Actually, that is not so. A great many of them have been bilingual, cosmopolitan, educated in English. S.M. Ashraf, for instance, retired as an income tax commissioner. So people have had a variety of jobs. Fayaz Rifat worked for All India Radio and so on. So the point is that they have read all sorts of things. Of course, a great deal of Urdu literature, I'm assuming, but a great deal of other literature. You took the example of Nayar Masood, whom I've not included here because I couldn't find anything that really fitted in with my theme here. But Nayar Masood has been so influenced by the French symbolists.
Yeah.
Yeah. So the idea of weaving a story of not just French symbolists, but the French symbolists who in turn influenced the Persian writers. And because Nayar Masood was a teacher of Persian and was extremely well read in Persian, so there were things that he read in Persian, which he kind of imbibed and brought that flavor along. So it's a combination of literary techniques and devices. There's stream of consciousness, there's symbolism, there's the metaphysical quality of the metaphysical poets that has been there in the English poetry tradition. So there are a whole lot of things. The story that you're referring to, The Serpent in the Well, here again, it's in fact, you very rightly took the example of Nayar Masood because it is very close in tone and tenor and setting, in the use of language, in the use of a pictorial quality, you know. The story doesn't move in a linear fashion and it doesn't end where it's supposed to end. It's not a Manto story with a, you know, with a black and white ending. It's a very ambiguous tale in that sense, and it relies on the atmosphere it creates. It relies on it being located deep in the forested heartland of India. So a story, given that setting, you don't expect it to have the same language, the same vocabulary as Manto's story written, placed in Amritsar, which is in the middle of a bloodbath, having a partition forced upon it. So the setting, the scenario, the age, everything, I think, impacts the quality of a writing.
Right.
We haven't talked about Rahman Abbas's story. He's a modern writer located out of Bombay. Again, very cosmopolitan. His work has been translated into many European languages. He's written the story which is called Asexual. It
Yes.
talks about the genderless quality, and there is a protagonist, a woman, who says, look, I can be your friend, I can be your companion, but don't expect anything else from me. So the demands and requirements of a heterosexual male gaze,
Yes.
what happens when they are not being met? This is a very modern sensibility. It is about two young people, possibly in Bombay, in a college, and so using the vocabulary of young people, even in its Urdu original, it employs a language which is very straightforward, which is very cosmopolitan. It is not the language of Husainul Haq, it is not the language of Begh Ehsas, it is the language of Rahman Abbas. Why? Because he himself is located there, his characters are located there, his story is located there. So I think geography, time, space, all of these come together sometimes in the Tana Bana, in the warp and weave of a story.
I think this inscrutability is very much present. Even in the Well of Serpents, we see the woman from the man's perspective, and we know that there is a wall. He will never be able to break that wall and know what the woman is thinking. And I found it very, very sort of brave for a writer to actually confront that wall, because ultimately you want to give your readers the pleasure of knowing, right? The knowledge. But to leave them sort of hanging in this sort of state of limbo, as it were, not
Yeah.
knowing exactly what passed between them, is very
Yeah.
interesting, really.
In the Urdu original, it's called bain, which means lamentation, a bain karti hui, which means a kind of a weeping, wailing cry. The
Right.
translator and the author between themselves decided to use this as the title. I didn't want to intervene and force my will. But the Urdu bain has that sense of lamentation. So the voices that are coming from the tree trunks, the voices that are coming in that forest are possibly wailing voices. And the story in the Urdu original is pointing towards that. But in the English, the translator and the author decided not to give that clue away. So it is left to you as the reader to find that clue somewhere in that story.
Decipher it. Yeah. Yeah. I have a comment from Tejasvi here. Um, do you see any historical trajectory of shifts in the male gaze in your selection of stories?
Yes, a Rahman Abbas story is a very modern story. A Rahman Abbas story, I'm not entirely sure if it could have been written in much the same way by Krishna Chandra or Rajinder Singh Bedi. Contrast the story by Rahman Abbas, Asexual, with the story by Rajinder Singh Bedi, which is also about the male gaze. But here, the woman is a woman. So, you can only, as it were, fall in love with a woman in distress, a woman as victim of circumstances, a woman even when she's pushing her hair back, she's doing it as a gesture of, I don't know, futility or hopelessness or something. And this man who's watching from a distance is finding even that gesture very attractive. And he is the protagonist who's just watching this woman in the first story. If you have read the story by Bedi, the one I'm referring to, and I'm trying to counterpose that with the story by Rahman Abbas, because they occupy two ends of the spectrum. And your question is about the historical trajectory. I see the story beginning from Rajinder Singh Bedi and coming to Rahman Abbas. And it's hard for me to imagine Bedi writing in much the same way. Why? Because he's clearly seeing the woman as a sexual object. And I'm not sure if he's giving that. Remember another story, very well read, much anthologized whenever we read partition story by Bedi called Lajwanti. This is about abducted women. Yeah. Somak, are you familiar with the story?
I'm not.
Abduction of women was a very common phenomenon. Women would be abducted, and
Right.
sometimes they'd be restored to their families. More often than not, they would stay on with the abductors,
Right.
take on their religion, and begin to live with them either as byatas, as married women, or as keeps, or as whatever. In one story, and there was a concerted effort both in Pakistan and in India to retrieve these women and restore them to their families. Bedi's story, Lajwanti, is about one such woman who's eventually restored to her family. And the man who treated her very badly, but nevertheless owned up. I mean, she was his wife, so he could treat her any which way. Now he's heeding Gandhi's call. Gandhi is saying, treat these women with respect. So in treating these women as respect, he puts her on a pedestal. In
Yeah.
the process, that woman is saying, what happened to my husband? He's no longer beating me up. Well, I'd rather go back to that. At least he owned me. At
Right.
least I felt I belonged to him.
Right.
It's a very
Right.
interesting story. I
Right.
don't know if that story can be written today. So to answer Tejasvi, your question about historical trajectories, history, circumstance, time, location sometimes decides your context. Will you or I or my daughter, who's a very strong feminist, accept a story like Lajwanti today? Are we willing to see that as a legitimate point of view? It's very hard for a modern young woman to say that, I'd rather be beaten up by my husband because at least it shows that he owns me.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So,
Absolutely.
but it was a perfectly valid point of view to take at that point in time. And many things are coming together, being woven up in that story. There's Gandhi's call for men to take back their wives, to show them love and care and respect, each of which this man is responding to. He's responding to Gandhi's call. He's saying, okay, I'm going to love my wife and treat her with respect. But in the process, he puts her on a pedestal. And that brings us to this whole Devification. I mean, there's a lovely story, Devi raised, of course. And there's so many instances in cinema, in literature, in popular culture of putting women on a pedestal.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
then we come to modern times where more and more and more male writers are saying they don't want to do that because they don't know very many women who want to be treated in that fashion. So yes, I mean, concerns change with history, with time.
Right. So I'll just urge people to also keep typing other questions, comments. But to go on with the conversation, I want to come to favorites, like whether you have any particular favorites in the collection. But before that, let me tell you my favorite, which
Yes.
is Ash in the Fire by Abdus Samad, which I thought was just a marvelous feat
Yeah.
of writing and complexity and writing from the perspective of a woman. Obviously, like I'm not judging whether it's very true or authentic or whatever, but it felt really, really astonishing to read that story because it is such a complex story. I don't want to give it away, but
Yeah.
this is the story of a woman who is caring, who is a nurse employed in caring for a man who has lost his brain functions probably and is unable to move. So she has to look after him. And a married man who has a wife. The wife doesn't want to look after him. So this nurse is employed, who is a virgin, who has never touched another man's body, as it were. And she is forced to take up this job because of the good pay in it. And it's really sort of chilling. That story really made me sort of, made my heart skip a beat. Like there are moments of real passion in that story.
Absolutely. What's interesting about the story is also about social class.
Yeah,
Um, this woman would never have been so close to a man like him because she's from a working class, impoverished family. She needs to work in order to earn a living because she and her family depends on that. The man is obviously a very rich man, and somewhere it's also indicated in the story that the man's wife is not willing to do anything for him because she feels that she has paid somebody to do everything for him. So the social class and the socio-economic class is very much a factor in this story. The other thing is that he is an exceedingly good-looking man.
yes,
Ordinarily, had this young woman from a socio-economic depressed family met this man, she would have been, she would have found him a very, very good-looking man. The fact remains that diminished though he is physically, he remains an extremely good-looking man. So how is a young woman to react to such a man in such a situation? I think as you're saying, it's an incredible story, and the scenario that it paints is incredible. But if you were to ask me my favorite, I mean, as a mother doesn't have favorites among her children, so as an editor, you're not supposed to have favorites because why have them and then why include the ones that you don't like? So I'm
right,
not suggesting that. But the story that struck me, and I must say that I'd done this randomly long ago, even before this collection was a gleam in my eye, quite literally. So this was a story I'd done, and maybe somewhere that was also preying at my mind. How do men look at women? And that is Something Odd by Zamiruddin Ahmed. This is a story about a woman who is a domesticated woman completely domestic surroundings. She's doing puja part. She has a mother-in-law. She has a young child. But she's a prostitute. She's being paid 50 rupees to
Yes.
service to men.
Mm.
But she's operating not from a quota. She's not operating from a marketplace, as it were. She's operating from her home. And two men, and this is obviously two young men who have come from Delhi, crossed the river Jamuna and gone to Shahadra, which is where she's living. Shahadra then, back then, the story is written in the 50s, I suppose, was a suburb. And you really needed to plan a trip to Shahadra in order to go there. So they have planned this trip to go there because from word of mouth, they've heard that here is a woman who operates from her own home. So one man has done this before, so he's habituated to the whole routine of it. The mother-in-laws, the child, the husband who has conveniently gone to the market, left the place, the field clear. A woman who does puja part, who even has an idol of a god inside her room. All of that, so the signs of domesticity are all there. And how this domesticity unsettles one man. And the other man who's now habituated to it is not bothered by it. I thought, and it's written in a very staccato way. There is no magisterial tone here. There is no narratorial voice here, alerting you to this or that, or pointing you towards this or that. It's up to you to pick up what you want. Yeah. And I picked up that constant sense of something's odd, and I like that.
It is so. I mean, it is one of the most Manto-esque stories, but actually it takes it a little further than that. In Manto, you probably would have had more information, more things to work with, as it were. But here, he just leaves you in this kind of...
He just leaves it.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
There's a comment from Kavya. What is interesting, I'm just going to read it out so that everybody else can listen to it. What is interesting is how we tend to forget that Urdu is a very alive language and not just a relic of a certain courtly culture from Awadh. To me, this is a very interesting aspect of looking at Urdu literature through this collection. And this conversation is bringing our gaze to its modernity and contemporaneity. My question is, have you come across a homosexual male gaze in sifting through the stories?
No. Now that you say, I should look out for it. I'm sure it is there. I'm sure it is there. Of course, it must be. In Urdu poetry, the beloved is an enigma. We don't know if it is a man, woman, or a child. And much has been written, scholarly work. Look out for Shamsur Rahman Farooqi's work. You'll find it online on who is the beloved in Urdu poetry. So I can answer your question with reference to Urdu poetry, where there's clearly a male gaze. In the poetry of Mir, for example, you know for a fact that he's talking about, well, not just men, but boys. So politically correct times, you are a little, troubled by that. But in fiction, I'm sorry, from the top of my head, I can't give you an example of a male gaze, of a man looking at a man. I will now look out for it more consciously, but I can tell you that it is there in much of Urdu poetry. In fact, it is so much so that it's a given.
Yeah, it doesn't quite surprise anyone, I suppose.
No. And it has been picked up for comment, for critique, for literary, for scholarly review. And I give you the example of S.R. Farooqi, who has written extensively on this. And people have wondered, earlier on, I was talking about the vocal masquerade, about men speaking in a fake female voice. So every now and then, you don't really know that, is this actually meant for a woman? The gender is left ambiguous,
Yeah. In fact,
in poetry, in Urdu poetry in particular, and of let's say 17th, 18th, 19th century, the gender is very often ambiguous.
So while other people type any other questions, I'm just going to ask one thing. In some of the stories, I felt, I can't sort of cite examples, but there is this moment when you feel that the narrative voice of the man is a slightly clumsy, awkward voice. Is that deliberate, or do you think that, is that a device, deliberate kind of approach, or is it something that's naturally there, in the writing, that they can't quite fathom where to place themselves when they're writing about women?
Yeah, I think that is the male gaze. That is the male gaze, you see. Um, and that is why I felt the need for a collection like this, to show you and that as you are, I'm so glad that you as a man are picking up on the awkwardness of that, and it means that somewhere one's purpose has been served, because mm, you know, there is a clumsiness to it. There is a what shall I say? There is a lack of confidence. There is a not the ring of authenticity in making those observations. You know, there's a clunkiness to it.
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
There's almost a kind of, awkwardness almost, like they don't want to sort of actually go out and say certain things because they don't know where they stand vis-a-vis
Yeah.
what's happening.
Yeah, it is
Yeah.
there in Bedi's story about a man, a neighbor looking at a woman neighbor and how he sees her. You know, actually, I didn't have time to maybe bring in those other elements, but look at cinema. How has cinema always looked at women?
Hmm.
धूप में निकला ना करो रूप की रानी,
Yeah.
or the stalker thing. Today we think stalking is bad, but cinema has normalized stalking, you know.
Absolutely.
And it's been, and the sad part is that the stalker gets the trophy, you see. So that not just normalizing, but saying that you're going to get what you want if you do this, if you persist in this, and women simply need to be pursued, you know, their trophies to be won. So there has been a normalization for a very long time of things that only now are being looked at as suspect. So today, I think with that hat of sensitivity on, we are conscious of the awkwardness. I think reading Bedi 70 years, 80 years later, we are struck by the awkwardness, but I think his readers may or may not have noticed that awkwardness. Why? Because it was so normal. It was normal to see women in a certain way, you know. I think now a great many men and women,
Yeah.
of course,
Yeah.
are conscious that, you know, this is striking a wrong note somewhere.
I mean, since you mentioned the stalkerish behavior, the story asexual almost veers towards that. There's a moment when you think this man is going to do something crazy
Yeah.
because he cannot believe that this woman is not giving him the time of day.
Absolutely, yeah. So this idea, but she's so upfront. I mean, that is the strength of Rahman Abbas as a storyteller, that he is actually making her come up with something that has not really been said in a lot of fiction, you know. I mean, I can't think of anything comparable with this, where a woman is saying that, look, I am asexual. I mean, I was born this way, you know, a bit like that song.
No hard feelings, basically. That's what she's saying. No hard feelings. That's
no
what
hard feelings. Well, you know, what was that song I'm trying to remember? Baby, I was born this way.
Yeah. Lady Gaga.
Huh?
Lady Gaga.
That's right. There you are. So there you are. So it's a very modern sensibility, you know, which is what Rahman Abbas is voicing. And interestingly, he's putting these words, I mean, words to that effect in the mouth of a woman who's saying that, look, don't expect that from me.
Yeah. There's one comment from Swati. How different is the woman's gaze on men, and how has it changed across time? It's the sort of the reverse of what we asked, actually, the kind of.
I gave early on the example of To Kill a Mockingbird, because I see that as a very authentic woman writing in a very authentic way about a man, you know. And there's so many other examples. I mean, not one or two or three or any others. When you read Arundhati Roy's depiction of the you know the that guy who's a pervert and who's selling those drinks. Or I mean, let me think of other examples. But there's so many examples of present day women fiction writers writing about men. This doesn't come up for as much review and as much debate and discussion. You know, there seems to be an okayness. If I may offer my own example, the one time that I have written fiction for Harper Collins in 2010, a collection of stories, a release and other stories, I had characters who were both men and women. And I don't think I was very hard pressed to find a male voice, and I don't remember that I had to work very hard to get that voice right. And in the reviews and comments that came after the book came out, I don't remember somebody pointing out that, listen, you made that man sound like yourself, or you made that man sound like a crazy woman, or something like that. So my experience is that we have so many examples of fiction of women doing a pretty okay job of impersonating a man, or at least not being found wanting or being caught out hitting the wrong notes. But we can think of very many examples of men not always getting the voice right of a woman in fiction.
I think it's a matter of close observation, because probably men don't observe as much as they gaze. It could be
Possibly.
that.
Possibly. Yeah,
Uh,
possibly.
So I don't know if there are other questions. Devika, are there any questions from anyone listening on Facebook or anywhere else?
No, I think this is it. Yeah.
Okay. So I think I don't have any other questions at the moment. I'm just going to urge people to buy the book and read it. It's just such a treasure trove of entertainment, really. Thank you, Rakhshanda. I hope you'll be translating more of these stories. I mean, stories like this, maybe the homosexual gaze.
Oh, that sounds very interesting. I'm going to certainly look out for it. And thank you for pointing me towards that. And thank you, Somak. This was a very, very enjoyable discussion.
Thank you for joining us. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Bye-bye. See you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Bye. See you.